Hi. So just to talk a bit about the main news at the moment, which is the G7 summit being held at Carbis Bay in Cornwall, and it's the UK's turn for this summit. This is actually the seventh time we have hosted, and just looking briefly through the history, the first time we hosted was 1977 in London under Jim Callaghan. Then 1984, again, London. 1991, London. 1998, Birmingham. Um, and 2005, Glen Eagles. 2013, Loch Earn in County Fermanagh. And now Carbis Bay, Cornwall. Some of those summits, there are a few little footnotes that are worth mentioning. I've got Bill Clinton's autobiography, My Life, and he mentions the redevelopment of Birmingham in a segment on the G7 summit, which was held in 1998. And incidentally, the Eurovision Song Contest, I believe, was also held in Birmingham. It was either the same year or the year before. Um, the Glen Eagles Summit is one I always remember because I was when the Loch Earn Summit was going on, I was in China and I only sort of passively watched that from the other side of the world. The Glen Eagles Summit was a big one because it was coinciding with the Make Poverty History campaign, the Live 8 concerts in London, which I was at. That was an incredibly busy week. There was also World War Two. At that time, it would have been 60th commemorations of the ending, I guess it was at that time. And also the London bombings all happened in that week. And then London won the Olympic bid over Paris. So that was all within 1 week. And I remember Tony Blair, of course, had to go back after the news of the 7/7 attacks. It was a very turbulent week. Um, there's going to be a lot of photo shoots, of course, around this. It's significant insofar as it's the first in-person geopolitical summit since the pandemic began. The ASEAN summit was held virtually, as was I don't know if the G7 went ahead last year. The G20 last year was held virtually. I can't recall off the top of my head if that was where that was held, if it was Riyadh in Saudi Arabia or somewhere else. I can't recall off the top of my head. But thinking of other summits, we of course also hosted the G20 in 2009. Now, there's a lot of talking points around this. It's a big story, of course. It's not every day that you have so many heads of state in one place, especially a fishing village in Cornwall. So there's going to be major security around there, I would imagine. Um, the British press tend to do this thing where they really focus on the presence of the American president, which is a little bit, it's important that Biden's first visit to the UK. And as some people have pointed out, it's refreshing to have a normal president here in contrast to his predecessor. However, there are other leaders. So I do think the British press focuses a little bit too much on, oh, the American president here. Well, yeah, but so is seven, eight, nine other leaders. There's the seven G7 leaders, hosted, of course, by Boris Johnson. Then we have Joe Biden of the United States, Emmanuel Macron of France, just coming after that assault that he faced. Angela Merkel of Germany, Mario Draghi, the new Prime Minister of Italy, Yoshihide Suga, new Prime Minister of Japan. Um, and am I missing anyone there? Yeah, then there's also leaders that are invited: Narendra Modi of India, Scott Morrison of Australia, Moon Jae-in of South Korea, um, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, Justin Trudeau of Canada, of course, in the main G7. And also Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union and Charles Michel also of the European Union, Commission President and Council President, respectively. So we have really, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 13 world leaders. I'm not sure if Morrison, Moon, Ramaphosa, and Modi have attended. I know they've been invited, but that's, a big lineup. Not as big as the G20, but still big. G7, of course, it was a G8 for a while, and then Russia departed. Um, I'm just going to start by touching on the relevance of the G7 as opposed to the irrelevance of it, and how I see that, and then go on to the issues being discussed. I think there is still relevance insofar as we're in a transitionary phase, and this was actually mentioned on CNN earlier by a commentator. There's no doubt about it, the G7 and this Atlanticist sort of structure is being challenged by emerging economies. There's no question that the G20 is more important than the G7 these days. And there's lots of other, of course, groupings. You have the BRICS, you have ASEAN, and there's numerous others. Um, but I still think the G7 has to be seen as important because we are in a transitionary stage, and this is a critical time for liberal democracies to take stock of where we are at and the challenges that we face. So, if nothing else, it's important for that reason, because you have the leaders of liberal democracies getting together in a way that isn't comparable to the UN, because the UN is everyone. Um, and, it's a unique opportunity in that sense for all these leaders to discuss the issues at once. So I don't think it should be totally dismissed. Um, Certainly, I would say its importance has decreased since Glen Eagles in 2005, but it is still important. And of course, there is a bit of ego involved. It's Boris Johnson's opportunity to show he's a world leader. Um, And there's a little bit of grandstanding and a little bit of PR for Cornwall, of course, as location. Um, and there'll be all the photo shoots with his pictures earlier of Dr. Jill Biden and Carrie Simmons on the beach. And, of course, there was a bit of controversy over supposedly a rebuke that the US State Department made towards the Johnson administration over Northern Ireland. Should they have done that? I'm not sure if that was very diplomatic. I think it's always better between allies to discuss differences candidly, but definitely in a diplomatic way. Why? Because the likes of Russia will definitely lap up any differences and exploit them and try and widen them, and yeah, it's just bad politics for allies to really be at loggerheads so openly. But I see some positive things here. Johnson's been very warm in his words. He's spoken of a fresh start. And Biden has been complimentary to Johnson as well. If you look at the president's social media postings, they're all very praising of the United Kingdom and of the special relationship. Johnson, interestingly, has said it's not a term that he likes because it's cliched, and I think he's right to an extent. Maybe it is time to look at this in a different, maybe give it a new name. I do think London-Washington relations are extremely important. However, I would add the caveat that relations with Washington is not our only important relationship, and we have to stop acting like it is. I think we need to have extremely close ties to the Commonwealth, particularly Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Um, but we really can't take our eye off the ball. I'll be making another video on global Britain, but I think it would be a mistake to just consider the United States as our only important relationship. It's not. I do think we need to do our best to work on any post-Brexit tensions with our European neighbours. And I'm a patriot, but I'm also outward looking. Um, and it's also the responsibility of our neighbours. So it's the responsibility of France and Germany to not escalate tensions. I mean, I think the way the French handled that fishing dispute didn't help things. Um, But unfortunately, if it gets into a situation, just to take that as a brief example of Britain and France at having a dispute, inevitably the European Union is going to back France because it's an EU member. So that puts us at a disadvantage, even if we have the moral high ground. It puts us at a disadvantage. So I think we need to work, really extra hard to have good relations with our neighbours. However, of course, we should stand our ground and stand up for our um, our sovereignty and our rights as well. But I really am a firm believer that liberal democracies have to, whatever differences we might have, whether it be on Brexit arrangements, whether it be on a host of other issues, those issues I believe are secondary to the challenges that we face from totalitarian states like Russia and China. Um, to me, that is, we can never allow a situation where the disputes or disagreements between Western liberal democracies, or I should say liberal democracies, because it includes countries like Japan and South Korea, we should not allow those to widen so much that we then allow totalitarian states to exploit the differences. I mean, you can guarantee Russia today, right now, the network will be going out of its way to try and find any disagreements or anything they can exploit at this summit. So, the agenda is very obvious. Um, the main agenda at the G7 is, of course, the pandemic. And a big thing is vaccine rollout. Johnson has said there's no reason why we can't vaccinate the entire country and donate to developing countries or contribute to developing countries. I see that sort of like foreign aid. I do think we've got a moral responsibility, but of course, the first responsibility of any government is to its own people, first and foremost. And that's not jingoistic. It's not nationalistic. It's just the responsibility of any government. Um, but I do think that developed countries, particularly countries like the UK that are producing effective vaccines, we do have a responsibility to distribute it. To the figure that's being quoted, 1 billion vaccines for the rest of the world, 500 million from the United States, incidentally. Biden said without any caveat, without any conditions. It sounds generous, but the world has almost 8 billion people. Mohammed Yunus, the respected economist, said that's nowhere near enough. There's a few ways to look at that. I mean, it's true, it's not enough when you consider the world population. But interestingly, the African countries have been, at least outwardly, less hard hit than certainly than South America, than the Indian subcontinent, and than Europe and North America. However, this situation may change. We may see further down the line countries like Uganda and Burkina Faso and South Sudan being hit really, really hard with COVID deaths. That hasn't happened yet, but it may well happen. Um, I mean, look at how hard hit India is now being hit, and that wasn't happening when European countries like Italy and the UK and France were being hit hard last year. So this thing is very far from over, particularly with new variants. Um, it's not just a case of it's the right thing to do morally, it's a practical thing to do because the nature of a pandemic, the more people in the world who are vaccinated, the sooner this thing has any chance of ending. Um, that means to me combating conspiracy theories. It means promoting safe vaccines. It means getting as many people vaccinated as possible, and also practical steps in terms of quarantine, in terms of temporary flight constrictions. But at the same time, there is other health factors to consider. There's mental health, the world's mental health. We've spoken about it in this country. It applies around the world as well. And business and the economy, those are things that cannot be sidelined. They're not trivial issues. So this is a massive, massive challenge facing the world leaders, and I don't envy them. It's a very difficult thing. I do think that although the pandemic is the main issue, obviously, there are other pressing issues. There's humanitarian crises in Tigray, in Yemen, in Burma. There is also China and Russia. We can never, ever, ever see those as secondary issues because I'm pleased to say Dominic Raab has been very outspoken. I don't discredit Dominic Raab as a foreign secretary. I think he has done what he has to do regarding China. He's been very on the mark with that, and I think rightly so. He's absolutely right that China has not fulfilled its obligations on autonomy for Hong Kong, quite the reverse. I think it's an absolute fallacy that the Hong Kong government thinks that they can delude, the UK or anyone else, that there isn't clearly a rollback of rights going on there. As for the Chinese regime, they're professional liars. The way I look at China is we need to be assertive. We need to stand up to them because bullies only understand the language of strength. And right now, the Chinese regime, even by their own lingo, wolf warrior diplomacy, that's the message they're sending to the world. That's China's so-called soft power. They're undermining tactics of, trying to stoke up the diaspora in other countries. That's just one example. Certainly security issues regarding technology. I mean, when it comes to China, it's not just one thing. There is a host of very real problems which shows Beijing's agenda, and that's why I don't think we should trust them. Now, I think there should always be at least one avenue of communication. Why? Because, say, for example, you had a situation of British and Chinese nationalists were collectively held hostage by, I don't know, an Islamist group in West Africa, and the British and Chinese governments had no choice but to work together to secure the release, something like that. So I think it's healthy to always have one avenue of communication, even in the dark days of World War II. In the closing days, there was an avenue of communication with some senior Third Reich members, obviously to negotiate surrender. So even in the darkest times, I think there should be even a sliver of communication. However, we do need to send out a strong message. We need to send out a message that this cannot be business as normal with this regime. Not whilst they are committing cultural genocide against the Uyghurs, not whilst they're trampling basic rights in Hong Kong, not whilst they are not being transparent with the world over the origins of the pandemic that's affected the entire world. And I don't think we should ever lose sight of the fact that this began in Wuhan. Um, I really think we need to take an assertive stance. Of course, they will bite back. They will have their editorials blasting Western colonialism and all the rest of it. Let them, let them. I think Beijing needs to understand what the mindset of the West is, and they do not respect weakness. They need to show strength. Of course, outwardly they'll laugh, they'll ridicule, they will, Chinese editorials will talk about so-called Western jealousy of China's success. I actually think that beneath the surface, it may be that CCP is not as confident as it seems. I think beneath the surface, they know that they are facing real challenges. The Chinese economy has slowed. Um, and whilst it is a very powerful country, um, I think it would be a mistake to see it as all powerful. For one thing, their military is big by manpower. I think actually it has some flaws. Manpower doesn't make up for efficiency, and I would argue that the British military, in definitely the American military, the technology is a lot more capable than what China has. So there's areas that we can look at to be confident. Now, I'm not talking about being at loggerheads just for the sake of it. I'm saying we have no choice because we're dealing with a regime that is determined to do whatever it can to get to a position of global hegemony. And when that happens, when China surpasses the United States, then the implications are very troubling because then they can get a grip on the internet and the implications of this go far and wide. So I do think it's important that we take a tough line with China. As for academics, I read about one guy at Oxford who said that we shouldn't talk about concerns about the Uyghurs or Hong Kong because we need good relations with China. These useful idiots, these stooges, I'm going to call them what they are, stooges of Beijing. These moral cards. That's how I feel about them. They need to be called out. I believe that British university departments that refuse to allow freedom of speech regarding China should have a funding cut. I think the government should take away funding from them and make them feel the heat. Because I think it's an absolute disgrace that you have British academics telling Hong Kong students they need to be quiet, or Chinese dissidents that they need to be quiet, because we better not offend the dragon. No way. That's intolerable. It's cowardly, but it's intolerable as well. So we need to send out a message to those university departments that if they're going to do this, they're going to lose funding. I firmly believe that. They need to feel the heat. And in cases where you have academics who are working with military um, with companies that have military connections, for example, supplying technology to the Chinese military, I think they need to be investigated by MI6 potentially for treason if they are knowingly sharing information, um, beyond security perimeters. So I think that that's really those are areas we need to take very seriously. We can work with China on issues like climate change. We can work with them in potentially uh, terrorist situations, but then China's basically holding hostages themselves, with the two Canadian Michaels. So, yeah, I do believe we need to take a very hard line. The same with Russia. Russia's backing of the Belarus regime, Russia's treatment of Alexei Navalny. Beijing and Moscow only understand strength. These are regimes that have no respect for human rights at all. So we need to understand what their thinking is. I think it's valid to criticize the human rights record, but then again, we also have to be careful because propaganda is a powerful tool. With what happened in Canada recently, that shocking discovery of the Indigenous children found at the school, that's horrendous. Now, of course, Canada's going to deal with that differently than China will. There'll be an inquiry. Trudeau's apologised. It's an awful thing. It's a dark stain on Canada's history. But that's the sort of thing that Beijing and Moscow will lap up, not because they care about human rights, but because they want to exploit any weakness they can. So what we need to do is be honest about our own problems. Um, but we absolutely should never ever apologise to Beijing or Moscow for anything. Um, I really feel very strongly about it. Because I think when you give bullies ground, they take the ground. Um, it's never ever easy standing up to totalitarianism, but we have to. And finally, I'm sure there'll be more to say about this, but I'm just going to conclude with this. It may well be that the G7 is less relevant than before, and there will be people saying, "Why is this happening? The rest of us have to socially isolate and so on." Well, actually, the restrictions are easing now. Uh, I really think that we need to see it for what it is. It's a transitionary meeting, an opportunity for liberal democracies to discuss the issues that really do have implications. So I wouldn't totally dismiss it. However, we need to be practical. The G20 is getting increasingly important. I mean, I could make a whole video about the relevance of the UN. There are certain things that go on at the UN that are absolutely abhorrent. When you have the likes of Saudi Arabia and Eritrea and China on the UN human rights body, it kind of makes a mockery of it. I mean, it's a total travesty. But my simple take on the UN would be, okay, if you want to get rid of the UN, what do you replace it with? If you are, there'll be people who are against globalization or against international cooperation of any kind, and they would call for splendid isolation. Well, would you have a situation where every country just does its own thing and that is it? Inevitably, the way human civilization is developed, countries need to work together. And with that comes, you know, came the development of the UN. Now, the UN is a deeply, deeply flawed organization. I've got many strong criticisms of it. Um, I think the Security Council should probably include India, arguably Brazil. I think the Permanent Security Council is too small. So there are areas that need to be looked at. Yeah, of course, the Chinese oppose Indian entry, and there's this situation with a permanent council, and often gets done unless there's universal agreement. Well, that's inherently a flaw because you're not going to get liberal Western democracies agreeing with a totalitarian single party state on human rights because they have no respect for human rights. For the Chinese, they'll always back up to other totalitarian regimes because they've got a vested interest in doing so because they're a totalitarian regime. See, it's that's their way of thinking. Anyway, the world's problems are not going to be solved with this meeting very clearly. But it is a way for like I say, for these leaders to take stock, and from that point of view, I think it is important. And yeah, I hope that definitely, if I have one hope from this, it's that these relationships are strengthened. There will be differences, but I really think that. There is no issue that Western liberal democracies cannot solve among themselves. Even something localized, for example, the death of Harry Dunn, the young lad that was killed by the wife of the American diplomat. Apparently, Biden's expressed sympathy for that case. Of course, he lost his wife in a car crash, so that may be a personal connection that maybe there can be some progress on that. I mean, the Dunn family is not vengeful. They don't want this woman to just be chucked in jail, but they do want her to face up to what she's done. I mean, she killed a young man from reckless driving and then left. So I think there could be something, even like a remote trial. There has to be something. She has to face justice, and British justice will treat her fairly. She's got, her lawyers don't need to fear a lack of due process or anything like that. She'll be treated fairly. Dunn family aren't vengeful; they just want justice for their son and for accountability. That's all. I'm confident something like that could be solved. Right, I'll round this up. There was a lot to say, but it's an important subject. Stay tuned. I'll probably be talking about the concept of global Britain today. I think it's very important. And maybe, yeah, other areas. How do we deal with China? Issues like that. These are all important subjects. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching.